The sky above Darham was no longer a sky. It was a battlefield, shredded open by fire and steel. Smoke billowed like black thunderclouds, choking out the stars and blotting the sun with a haze of death. Fighter jets screamed overhead, slicing through the dark, unleashing payloads of destruction on the fractured earth below. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the crumbling town, shaking the ground as if the world itself were trying to break apart. Where once stood homes, markets, and laughter, now there were only ruins. Cracked stone and twisted metal jutted out from the earth like bones from a corpse. Trees had been reduced to charred stumps. Roads had become trenches, and silence had been replaced by the endless symphony of gunfire, shelling, and screams. The town of Darham, once vibrant and full of life, was now a skeleton, a ghost haunted by war. In the midst of that desolation, a heart still beat. Captain James Whitaker, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood, crouched low behind the crumbling remains of a brick wall that had once been part of a family's home. His uniform was torn, soaked with sweat, grime, and the blood of comrades he could no longer reach. Dust clung to him like a second skin, and his eyes, once sharp with purpose, now flickered with exhaustion and hardened, haunted clarity. In his hands, he held his rifle tightly, not just as a weapon, but as the last anchor to his identity. The mission had unraveled faster than anyone had expected. He had led 12 men into this hell, believing it was a crucial operation: retrieve intelligence, disrupt enemy supply lines, and get out. But the enemy had been waiting. Ambushed, outnumbered, and overwhelmed, James had watched one by one as his unit was torn apart. Now, only he and Private Oliver Grant, a 19-year-old combat medic fresh out of training, remained. They had been on the run for hours, maybe days, it was hard to tell. Time had blurred under the weight of adrenaline, fear, and survival instinct. Oliver huddled beside James, his breath shallow, trembling hands cradling a blood-stained medical pack. His youthful face was smudged with ash, his helmet slightly crooked. His eyes, wide, frightened, but still clinging to something, turned to his captain. "Captain," he whispered, barely audible over the rumble of distant artillery. "We're not going to make it, are we?" James turned to look at him. The question cut through the noise more deeply than any explosion. In Oliver's voice, James heard more than fear. He heard a plea for truth, a yearning not just to survive, but to understand if the fight still meant something. James didn't answer immediately. He held the boy's gaze, reading the silent storm behind it. For a moment, he saw his younger brother, Nathan, who had once smiled just like that, eyes bright with idealism. Nathan had been killed 3 years ago in a drone strike. Wrong place, wrong time. The official report called it collateral damage. That was the moment James stopped believing in clean wars. "We will," he finally said, his voice rough and resolute. "But we have to move now." There was no certainty in his words, only determination. Hope, as fragile and flickering as it was, could not be allowed to die here. Not yet. He peered over the wall. The street beyond was a war zone littered with debris and the fallen. Gunfire echoed 2 blocks over. Enemy patrols were sweeping the area. The enemy, a local insurgency turned paramilitary force, had been better armed and better informed than intelligence had suggested. Someone had leaked their position. Someone wanted them dead. James reached into a pouch and pulled out a torn map, its edges burned. He pointed at a location circled in red, an old church that intelligence believed might still be intact. It had a bell tower and stone walls. High ground. Cover. "If we can reach that church," James said, "we might be able to hold out long enough for extraction." Oliver nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "Okay, lead the way." Together, they left the shelter of the wall, keeping low, navigating through alleys filled with broken glass and abandoned lives. Every movement was calculated. Every breath could be their last. They passed the remains of a marketplace. Colorful cloths still fluttered in the breeze, soaked now in soot and ash. Toys lay scattered near a destroyed stall. A child had dropped them in panic. Or perhaps never got the chance. James paused, glancing briefly at a small stuffed bear buried under rubble. His jaw tightened. This war wasn't being fought in deserts or far-off forests. It was in people's kitchens, bedrooms, and schools. And he was part of it. They kept moving. Gunshots cracked in the distance, growing louder. They were being hunted. Oliver stumbled, gasping for air, but kept running. James placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, steadying him. They were close now. As they neared the church, James's mind raced. He had been trained to fight, to lead, to survive. But nothing in training prepared a man to watch his friends die, to see innocence vaporized, to live with decisions that tore lives apart. They reached the church just as flares lit up the sky. A distant helicopter thundered overhead, but not theirs. Not extraction. A warning. Inside, the church was hollowed by fire. The stained glass was shattered, sunlight filtering through the smoke in hues of red and gold. It was strangely beautiful, holy, even in its destruction. James and Oliver took cover behind the pulpit. For now, they were safe. But for how long? As Oliver checked their last remaining supplies, James stared at the cracked crucifix still hanging on the far wall. He wasn't religious, but something about it stirred him. Maybe it was the idea of sacrifice. Maybe it was guilt. Oliver sat beside him, finally letting his hands rest. "Captain," he said softly, "did we do the right thing coming here?" James didn't answer right away. He looked out at the broken town beyond, then down at the boy beside him. "I don't know," he said. "But if we give up now, nothing we've lost will mean anything." Outside, the war continued to rage. Inside, two soldiers held on a hope, not because they believed it would save them, but because it was the only thing they had left. They moved like shadows between the wreckage, slipping from ruin to ruin beneath a sky still echoing with the growl of distant aircraft. The world around them was a graveyard of what once had been. Houses collapsed into rubble, trees reduced to blackened stumps, cars abandoned and rusting in twisted silence. Each breath James took was thick with a stench of smoke, blood, and the bitter tang of gunpowder. The air itself felt heavy with death. Captain James Whitaker led the way, motioning for Private Oliver Grant to follow close behind. Their boots crunched softly on broken glass and scattered debris. Every movement was calculated, tense, as if the walls themselves might watch them. Their lungs burned with every inhale, but they could not stop. Enemy patrols were nearby, close enough to hear their voices, even if the words made no sense. They spoke in a language James didn't recognize, but language wasn't necessary to understand their intent. The tone was sharp, aggressive, punctuated by laughter that felt far too cruel for such a place. No survivors. That was the unspoken rule etched into the silence. No prisoners. No witnesses. Once, not long ago, Darham had been a quiet village nestled between two lazy rivers. It had thrived on agriculture and generations-old traditions. Children had run barefoot through flower-draped lanes. Families had gathered at dusk under oil lamps, sharing stories passed down for centuries. Music echoed from open windows, and laughter mingled with birdsong in the golden light of early evenings. But that was before war arrived. What began as a civil conflict between a corrupt ruling government and a determined separatist movement soon spiraled into something far more complex and far more violent. Darham's central location, once a source of prosperity, became a curse. It sat on vital supply routes and had bridges both sides wanted to control. Within weeks, foreign powers became involved. Not for justice, not for peace, but for profit, influence, and control of regional resources. Weapons were funneled into both sides like water into a drought. Mercenaries arrived. Drones filled the skies. Propaganda spread like wildfire. The line between liberator and occupier blurred beyond recognition. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their homes transformed into fortresses, then into ashes. James had come to Darham as part of an Allied mission, tasked with peacekeeping, intelligence gathering, and ensuring stability. That's what the official brief said. But he knew now those were just words, convenient masks for operations that had little to do with peace. He had once worn the uniform with pride. He believed in duty, in protecting the innocent, in making a difference. That belief had pushed him through training, through early deployments, and into command. But the deeper he went into the war zone, the more the truth peeled away his certainty, like old paint on a ruined wall. Who was the enemy anymore? Was it the rebels, many of whom were farmers and teachers before they took up arms to defend their land? Was it the government, who dropped bombs on its own people under the pretext of eliminating threats? Or was it the faceless foreign commanders, people like himself, who came with polished boots and loaded guns, preaching peace while carrying out covert agendas? Every firefight left him with more questions. Every child he passed staring at him with hollow eyes made it harder to breathe. They passed what had once been a school. The roof was gone. Blackboards were shattered. Tiny desks lay scattered among shell casings. A doll's head stared up at him from a pile of dust, its plastic features frozen in a smile, its body nowhere to be found. James felt something twist inside him. The war wasn't just destroying buildings, it was erasing memories, families, entire futures. Behind him, Oliver stumbled slightly over a piece of broken pavement. He was young, too young for all this. His hands shook, and though he hadn't spoken in minutes, James could see the horror written across his face. It was a look James recognized. He had seen it in the mirror not long ago. They reached a half-demolished bakery and took shelter behind what remained of its counter. James scanned the street again. No patrols in sight for now. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. His mind drifted to a time before this mission. He remembered briefing rooms filled with commanders who spoke in acronyms and sanitized language, pointing at maps like this was a game. He remembered being told that Darham was critical, that success here would turn the tide. But what tide? Whose victory? What were they truly fighting for? James looked at Oliver, who was gripping his rifle like a lifeline. The boy hadn't even grown into the uniform yet. And yet here he was, thrown into a conflict older and deeper than he could ever understand. James felt something inside him settle. The mission wasn't about sides anymore. It wasn't about flags, orders, or command structures. It was about getting this boy out alive. It was about protecting what little humanity was left in a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of another explosion. But in that moment, James's mind was clear. He didn't know who the real enemy was, but he knew what he would not become. A sudden crack of gunfire shattered the silence, forcing James and Oliver to dive into the nearest building, a half-collapsed home that had clearly seen its share of violence. They landed hard, coughing as dust rose around them. The moment the chaos outside faded, an eerie stillness took its place. Inside, the house was frozen in time. Bullet holes riddled the faded wallpaper, and a dark pool of dried blood stained the wooden floor. Furniture lay broken, splintered by shrapnel or dragged aside in panic. In one quiet corner, almost hidden beneath debris, sat a tiny pair of children's shoes, scuffed, one slightly tilted, as if their owner had been interrupted mid-step. Oliver knelt beside them, staring silently. Then he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Captain, do you ever wonder if we're the bad guys?" James stayed quiet for a moment, the weight of the question settling between them like smoke. He looked at the shoes, not just as objects, but as the echo of a life suddenly lost, a child who would never run or laugh again. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and distant. "I wonder if it even matters anymore." Outside, gunfire resumed. But inside, guilt spoke louder. They reached the extraction point just after midnight. The signal flare had been fired hours ago, but no chopper came. The radio was dead. They were abandoned. Again. James was not surprised. Command had made it clear. The mission was expendable. The intelligence they were sent to retrieve, a coded journal from a defected rebel commander, was deemed too sensitive to risk extraction if things went sideways. Now, hiding in the shell of a burnt-out church, James examined the journal they had recovered. Pages were filled with locations, names, encrypted conversations. Evidence that the war was being manipulated from both sides by a weapons cartel. No ideology, just profit. They're selling death, Oliver said after James translated the notes. To everyone. James nodded. And we're just pawns in their game. Oliver's face hardened. Then let's break the board. The next morning they made a decision. They would not run. They would expose the truth. Using the enemy's own abandoned communications tower, they patched together a signal. James, speaking in English and the local dialect, broadcasted the contents of the journal across open channels. Every base, every rebel camp, every journalist and satellite that could hear them received the same message. We are soldiers. We are not traitors. We are not heroes. But we have seen the truth. This war is not about freedom. It is about profit. The weapons you carry, the orders you follow, they are written by men who will never bleed. Read the journal. See the truth. And choose your side again. They expected silence. But the silence broke. From the north, rebel forces began retreating, abandoning positions with coordinated precision. From the south, government units hesitated to fire, their ranks splitting into factions. Protests erupted in allied countries back home as whistleblowers came forward, confirming the transmissions. A war that had burned for 10 years began to flicker. But peace doesn't come without blood. 2 days after the broadcast, mercenaries hired by the cartel stormed the tower. James and Oliver held their ground as long as they could, but bullets have no conscience. James was shot 3 times. He died shielding Oliver, who barely made it out alive, the journal clutched to his chest. 3 years later, Darham had changed. The rubble was cleared, homes rebuilt. Children played where tanks once rolled. But the scars remained. A memorial stood in the center of the town square. A marble statue of a soldier, face obscured, rifle broken, holding out a book. At the base, a plaque read, "In memory of those who gave their voice to end silence. War feeds on lies. Peace begins with truth." Oliver visited every year. Now a journalist, he had devoted his life to war reporting, not just battles, but the truths buried beneath them. He stood there now, hand on the plaque, remembering the man who had once saved him and tried to save a world that had lost its way. And somewhere, in the silence of a town reborn, the echoes of James's final words still lived.